Hi, thanks for joining us for Programmers Week and specifically today for Product Day. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Mark Castiglioni. I'm a Client Solution Director at Cognizant Softvision within the North America Solutions team, where I work directly with our clients to plan their mission-critical digital initiatives and accelerate the development of these products in advance of SPE engagements. I've been a part of Softvision now for 7.5 years, and I've been delivering on these product backlog workshops for our clients over the last 5 since we have developed this process. I perform this process for clients big and small across the globe to enable over $100 million in product delivery services in that time using this process we're going to be talking about today. I'm really excited to talk about the Softvision's product backlog workshop process and discuss how we use this to do initial planning with our clients to accelerate delivery of their digital products. I hope that through this presentation, you are able to understand how we are transforming the planning of digital initiatives together with our clients before we start to land teams and lead to successful project starts and execution. I encourage everyone to share your questions in the chat module so we can answer them accordingly. Without further delay, let's get started. So here's the agenda of topics I will be covering in our presentation today. During this presentation, I want to describe the overall process of our product backlog workshop in detail while referencing examples from workshops I have executed to really connect on what we do in the workshop and why this is the best approach to partnering with our clients to plan out and enable product development before we have exchanged a contract with a client or started to land teams. This session will address how we approach the planning of a product's development to get that early consensus with the client on the resulting project implementation and to enable our SPE engineers to quickly hit the ground running as we start to onboard and get into those early sprints. So we'll discuss how we used to partner with clients to plan and why we need to do something different. We'll dive into the details of the workshop process, what it is, what client scenarios or situations it works best in, what client artifacts or documentation we typically use as inputs to the process, then discussing the details of the process and the timeline of activities we do, followed by who the participants of the workshop process are from the client and Softvision, and we'll explore out the deliverables we create during the workshop that comprise the planning we do here. And I'll wrap this up lastly with what this process enables for our clients and SPE teams to accelerate development of these digital products. The first thing we'll talk about is the old way we used to work with clients on pursuits and why this ineffectiveness led us to create the product backlog workshop process to really partner with the client early in the planning process. So in my career, I've been a part of many pursuits with clients, and I wanted to reference what we used to do to explore these opportunities with clients and make proposals. The old way was really not collaborative. We used to spend a few hours getting some details from clients to understand their needs and objectives for a digital product, typically without a documented product backlog. And then we would go internal and we would whiteboard, solution, and estimate with limited information, typically in a vacuum as we're doing it by ourselves, to build out that overall approach, timeline, resource plan, budget, and a proposal that was really based on a lot of assumptions we had to make in a short period of time. And during the present out to a client, we typically always had to iterate on these misaligned assumptions we carried into our solutioning, leading to delays in agreement and getting started. This really did not start us down the path of immediately partnering or providing value for the stakeholders of a product. It didn't enable us or our clients to really explore out the problem and build up the details for the plan together, leading to alignment issues and contention within the client relationship early and throughout the development of a project. We had to move away from this approach to better plan and position projects together with our clients for more successful outcomes in development. Now let's talk through the definition of what the product backlog workshop is, where it fits, why we do it, and what the process is. So this is a view of Softvision's overall capabilities for SPE services to work with our clients on building their digital initiative, making their digital initiatives a reality. The workshop may start directly after a product discovery engagement by Softvision product teams. And this topic was covered in the last session by Ryan and Sean today. For those that missed that session, product discovery is a focused, time-constrained process that uses design and product thinking to align and accelerate solutions through product ideation for a new product, service, or feature to the market. The workshop may follow this product discovery phase, or in a lot of cases, we do the workshop activity with our client when they have done the internal work on a digital initiative strategy themselves, and they have a product that they are ready to start to develop. The main intent of where the workshop fits into our overall process within Softvision is that this is a key enabler to planning and accelerating the overall delivery of that initiative by making the early plan for the what, the how, the when, and the plan to quickly build working software that can immediately lead to value for our clients. Either way, the product backlog workshop is really about getting ready to get to building and accelerating the progress to delivery. So overall, the product backlog workshop, it's a framework we use for that upfront investment in our client's product to really meet them where they are in their planning, and then work together to discuss the product specific needs and objectives in a documented, product backlog driven, really by consensus together. The spirit of the workshop, product backlog workshop, is to spend a bit of time up front, and that's typically a 1 to 2 week time frame, to properly plan the product's development efforts directly with our clients and get alignment between the client stakeholders from product, business, technology on a shared vision, scope, milestones, timeline, and budget, while exploring out different stakeholder expectations and implicit assumptions to really bring this all to the forefront in our initial planning and get things documented as we go through this process. We make this investment in our client's success by bringing the right team together from the client and Softvision to get into the details of planning, from milestone definition and successful outcomes to an aligned agile-based product backlog, and then addressing those usual concerns. What are we building? What are the details of the requirements? What are the priorities? What's the most important thing that we need to do first? What is the team that we need to target at this work? And where are they sourced from? Is it wholly Softvision, or is it a co-blended team with our clients? When do we need to start that team? How fast can that team start to build the scope? And what will it cost? What is our budget? How long will it take? And when will we be able to deliver capabilities to our end users? The workshop has all the tools and process to enable us to answer these questions together with our clients. But one of the really big elements of the workshop that I like to stress is that we do the definition of the product backlog and the sizing of the requirements together with our clients through documentation and then going into sizing together. So we do a planning poker activity inside the course of the workshop process to mathematically determine the size of the defined scope and story points, and then use this to construct our teaming model, timeline, and budget that is needed to execute this scope. During this process, the client is really able to put their fingers on the knobs to guide the plan and approach, and really, fine tune what their objectives are to how we need to actually go about executing the work. And we do that the client does that together with their resources as well as Softvision thought leadership. So we'll talk about this a bit further as we get into the actual deliverables. But the workshop is the right way to approach this initial planning. And one of the main messages we use to describe the workshop process when we're talking with clients is that we really need to slow down so we can speed up. What this really means is, let's not jump into starting a project right off the bat, but instead, let's take a little bit of time up front to properly plan together before rushing into development. We really need to kick the tires on the product direction, scope, and details to build an accurate approach together that really enables rapid and accurate implementation of a digital initiative aligned to those objectives, timeline, budget, and other constraints that need to be established early, understood by all stakeholders, but documented so that they're not implicit assumptions in something that we've agreed to together. So we'll talk through a couple of the scenarios where we get engaged with clients to meet them where they are at in their planning using the product backlog workshop process. So here are some of the scenarios we have encountered as we've partnered with clients on product backlog workshops. I'll say that every workshop I have done comes in from a different starting point and needs for what we need to do within the client to enable this planning. The workshop itself is a framework. It's meant to be flexible and adapt to the level of planning a client has done so far and what planning we still need to do to set the right approach. Whether a client needs help in the definition of an effort or in validation of their planning and creating that partnership to start executing, the workshop is that key enabler and is flexible to meet their needs. Now, on this slide, I talk about a couple different areas that we can address. Where the client is, how they're looking to contract, how they're looking to approach the solution. The workshop can fit into any of these areas as we go through this. And as well, that I've done workshops, for clients that are executing greenfield solutions, brownfield, or we're looking at modernizing and migrating to the cloud. So all of those are key situations that this process can directly fit in, and we can start to get a predictable approach that we can use to go into execution. So as we start the workshop process, we always have some standard inputs from the client that we use to do these. We'll take a look at a few of those. So these represent some of the typical inputs we have from clients prior to the start of a product backlog workshop. Now, these may be some that come directly from the client or some that come from our product discovery process. But it doesn't mean that all clients that we start to do work on within the workshop have all the same artifacts when we start, or the same level of details to these if they've created them themselves. We will use whatever information a client has to get started in the planning and positioning of the workshop activity. Now, I have started workshops that have led to successful product implementation work that have begun with inputs of, either they had a full product backlog, BRDs, and even bullet points on a slide deck. Or there's even cases where a client has no requirements written down. We start to explore out some user experience design screens and prototypes that they made. But really, we're starting with some initial discussions with the product owners to really frame out the context for the work. The main point is that we will use any and all artifacts a client currently has to accelerate the work we do within the workshop to get contextual to the specific planning needs a client has to do, and customize the approach on the workshop. And this is kind of back to my point previously that the workshop is a framework to really cherry pick the right places we need to spend more time on during the workshop to dive deeper, but ultimately come to a standard set of deliverables at the tail end of a product backlog workshop process as our outputs that we create during this workshop. So I look to really get these artifacts as we're planning out the workshop logistics, so prior to us starting the main sequence of the process, so I can understand the product, its direction, and the scope the client intends to implement. We'll use these artifacts to start to build a starting point to the product backlog to accelerate the work we will do within the workshop. And the worst thing I ever want to start a workshop on is with a blank sheet of paper. So we always start with something that resembles a product backlog based on the artifacts the client has sent. So I've talked a bit about what the workshop is, what are the client situations we typically engage this process in, and what information we use from our clients to set the stage. Now let's talk through what the processes and sequence is that we execute during the workshop. So this is the overall process of the product backlog workshop, really starting with the inputs on the left side of the screen here to the workshop and the initial preparation we do to stage it. The staging of the workshop includes a workshop 101 session with client stakeholders to really set expectations, talk through the process, kind of align on what are their expectations, what are our expectations of the client to interact with us on this process. We also define out the agenda, attendees, and logistics. And also included are those conversations with the client on the context for the product that we are looking to point the workshop towards. At this time, this is when I would create that preliminary product backlog representing the product needs from discussions with the product owners and provided inputs from the client. Now, I naturally expect that any backlog I'm creating at this time is going to change during the workshop. And I really like to stress with the workshop team between Softvision and the client that this backlog is wrong. I've created it myself in a vacuum, but we need to have a starting point to really facilitate the conversation and refine this preliminary backlog together during the overall workshop. The main body of the workshop process occurs in steps 2 through 5 over a 1 to 2 week time frame. And these sessions had historically been in-person, on-site exercises that we have done from a big room planning standpoint, but Obviously, we've had to scale to meet demand and the impacts of the coronavirus, but it has not overall impacted what we're doing from a planning standpoint or the outputs that we generate from a workshop. The workshop itself really starts with a 1 to 2 day activity for the backlog workshop sessions. And this is really where we're doing the meat of the backlog build out with the client. So we're working with client stakeholders to discuss, validate, and ensure that everybody has the same understanding of the context and objectives to the digital initiative prior to us getting into the backlog itself, so that we all have the same expectations. And sometimes I've seen that clients, their stakeholders don't always have the same understanding of what a particular initiative is. So I like to make sure we're level setting right at the start. We then get into the details and really consensus building and documentation of the product backlog, discussing some of those high level artifacts such as the vision statement, the roadmap, intended product milestones, while documenting rough timelines and success criteria for particular milestones and releases that a client is looking to target over time. And also the strategic themes that come up from the client's strategy definition. Then the bulk of that 1 to 2 days is really spent getting into the detail of all the high-level EPIC requirements, starting with the functional side of the backlog first, then exploring out the technical. In a lot of my workshop cases, we are validating, editing, or creating stories within the workshop and documenting those early assumptions or proto acceptance criteria for each line item in the requirement list that we are working with. And really at this step, we are ensuring we are documenting the what. So we'll work with all stakeholders on that conversation, getting agreement and documenting of the requirements needed line item by line item. And at this time, we are not really creating sprint ready stories. Rather, they are closer to epics as a part of the planning activities we're doing to set the stage for execution. But we'll map each of those requirements across several dimensions: milestones, epics, features, personas, priority, systems, etc. in our backlog tool. And since we are largely doing these remote these days, I'm really looking for attendees heads nodding on camera and verbal agreements as we are documenting the backlog and making sure we've captured requirements the correct way. Now, this is all done in a collaborative roundtable with the client's product owners, business and technology stakeholders, really all taking part in that definition with guidance, clarifications, questions, additional details from the Softvision resources and sessions. Once we have the functional backlog, we start to address the technology architecture discussion. So technical integrations, security requirements, technologies to use, where it might fit within their SDLC, and then other key factors such as DevOps and environmental issues. We ensure that the functional side of the product backlog is supported by technology enabler spikes that we write out as written requirements into the product backlog to ensure that we have that full picture of the needs that we need to have and that we're getting agreement and consensus as we're documenting those. Our emergent solution architecture really starts to surface at this point is intended to be a guide to the pod team that will be implementing the product that comes out of our workshop based on documented assumptions about direction and the backlog spikes or proof of concepts that support efforts to implement or make an iteration through a technical spike to make a technical decision. But one of the main points is we're not saying this is absolutely how we need to construct the application. This is the technical how. We give the parameters and shape for how we expect it to go, and then use that as assumptions that can guide the team on direction they want to take. But it's ultimately up to the pod team that's going to start to implement the work to make the detailed decisions in execution. Now, we are ultimately successful in this step 2 when we have a documented, scoped, and agreed upon epic backlog of functional and technical requirements prioritized to milestones. Now, once we have a backlog in place, we go through a planning poker activity to story point or size out each story. This is done with stakeholders on both the Softvision side and the client side coming together. I'll have an example of what this looks like in a few slides down when we start getting into that. But really what we're doing here is story pointing or sizing each story and also documenting our assumptions on the how we feel that particular requirement will go, so that we can use that to validate out the sizing we give. Once we have a completely sized product backlog, we can then work on starting to get into teaming and capacity modeling to plan out the logistics of how we will address this backlog with agile-based pods. Like everything else within the workshop, this is something done at the forefront with our clients. So we use a modeling tool that we use to plan out agile-based capacity pods. I will address that a little bit later in the conversation here, but ultimately, this is another that when I talked about the client being able to adjust knobs, this is us coming together on the model to have the timeline, the resources, where they're sourced from, when they start, when they leave, so that we can put together an overall plan that we can agree on. Now, it's really at this phase of the workshop that things tend to get interesting as the plan and resulting budget starts to be surfaced. But that budget and that capacity plan is directly traceable to the backlog we described together with the client, the sizes that we put together, the priorities of requirements. Now, in a lot of cases at step 4, we may iterate at this point to really enable the client to change those levers, or, which may mean changing what the milestones look like. It may mean changing what we do from a prioritization standpoint. But really, we're trying to craft together the ideal implementation approach and budget while ensuring that we've mitigated risk concerns and not made something that is not a sustainable execution effort. And lastly, as a part of the process, we work together with our clients on a concise proposal that's really aligned to the plan we have defined in the workshop, and really surfacing up the artifacts that we've created during here to really detail our understanding, plan, and approach to the project, and enable the next steps of the internal sale and evangelization within the client in preparation to align the pods to the plan. A typical backlog workshop schedule is described here. The main point is that even though the workshop is itself what I described earlier as a 1 to 2 week exercise in duration from steps 2 through 5, it doesn't mean that we're fully allocating client and Softvision resources for 2 whole weeks. Rather, we're front loading the activities we do in that step 2 of product backlog workshop sessions to get to those details of the product backlog over a 1 to 2 day time frame, and then have more targeted conversations and schedule to address steps 3, 4, and 5. So this schedule is shaped and refined within our client prior to the start of the workshop into an agenda document we agree with. So we all have the right expectations of where we are in the process, what are we going to be talking about next, and how does it flow across from a date standpoint. We work with the client stakeholders on the specific scheduling of activities to align with client calendar constraints. And ultimately, this means every workshop agenda takes a slightly different shape and duration to activities, while ensuring we get to the same point at the end with the defined plan and deliverables we create together. So I wanted to throw up a sample schedule of a workshop that I've executed with a client in the past. In this example, the client had a very large product backlog they were looking to implement on a phase 2 initiative of a product they started off with an MVP. So we had to spend a bit more time up front in the workshop preparation to properly stage our scope and discussion of what we're going to be actually addressing within the workshop activities. Once we got to the workshop, we followed through on the process to really scope the initiative's requirements to the client's objectives, and really whittle that list of over 400 stories to about 310 that we felt was going to be in scope for that second phase. But that also meant that in some cases, we were adding stories that were missing to the overall list, or making changes to story definition of the ones that we did keep. We sized the overall product backlog together with the client and defined 4 variations of teaming models on how we could approach the project. Like I said before, that step 4 teaming capacity modeling, this is where we typically take iterations. The client wanted to ask a couple different questions. What if we dropped priority 2 items? What would that look like? And what if we added another pod team to the delivery? And we got to 4 models. If we iterate across the 4 questions, we had 4 different 4 different budgets, 4 different timelines, or 4 different ways of looking at how we went through execution. So that when we took this to a proposal, the client could make an informed decision on which direction that they wanted to take. Now, this particular example I like to use, we executed this current phase of this product with the client, and I've since workshopped the subsequent 3 phases to this product. What I really see is once we start interacting with clients on this different way of approaching their planning, clients tend to come back and want to go through product backlog workshops on subsequent phases or different technical initiatives that they have within their 4 walls. So this is an example of the schedule we will follow on day 1 or day 2 of the workshop within that backlog workshop sessions. So this represents that front-loaded part of the schedule I've talked about previously. It's really divided between day 1 activities and day 2. Day 1 is typically where I'm focusing in on the business functionality of the product backlog, and it's in this case where we're really focused on that business strategy and functionality we're looking to enable, with the majority of our time spent getting deep into the development of the components of the product backlog that represent our scope. Day 2, assuming that we've gotten through everything on day 1 and the agenda does need to stay flexible based on conversation. Day 2, I do like to start it off with conversations around UX design, looking at technology architecture discussions and roadmaps, and then coming back into requirements to build out technical enablers, technical spikes, non-functional requirements that need to be a part of the backlog and something that we account for in our overall capacity. Following through on that day, we'll talk through a project approach and the agile considerations we need to make to blend our agile approach with how the client looks at executing projects. And then even coming back and saying, now that we have the completed backlog, let's review that and have an eye on the shape of the milestones, making sure we're achieving the objectives that we're looking to achieve on them, and also looking at what the defined releases are. So where we're trying to set up for all that is getting into sizing. So we start off with an approach of, our perspective of sizing an overall product backlog, and really try to align with the client on, how they view story points, and capacity and that planning for velocity tracking. So we'll spend time talking through what that approach looks like, and then start doing some initial planning poker, pulling forward some what I refer to as low contention stories that are easy to understand it within our backlog, and then using that as the starting point of getting into sizing. Now, I will talk about sizing, in a couple of slides, but I'll say at least right now, sizing for us as a part of the workshop effort, I do use Fibonacci-based sizing to be able to do this. Because of how we tie it into our capacity planning. But we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So we've talked a bit about the sequence of the process. I'd like to talk about who is involved, both from the client side and the Softvision side. So during a workshop, Softvision will bring resources to align with the client's resources, really across the disciplines needed for that specific product. The attendee list is planned out with the client in the preparation phase, but the workshop itself, it's always facilitated by a client solution director, a master of ceremonies. Typically that's somebody like me or a member of my solutioning team. So we are dedicated resources that deliver these workshops across Softvision clients. Now, we will provide technology SMEs that align to the type of technology solution the client is looking for. And these resources will partner with the client SMEs during the workshop. This typically includes solution or technical architects as a starting point. It may also include other SMEs as necessary, such as security architects, DevOps resources, quality engineering resources, or even developers on the product if this is a workshop that we're using to plan the next phase. If the product is a user-facing product, we will bring a UX designer into the workshop to get visual and get some rapid prototypes from some key requirements or user flow to be able to include that as a part of the discussion and into our resulting proposal deck. Now, I always want to bring in a delivery director into the workshop, and that's really the voice of reason for delivery. This is the person who's going to be providing the executive oversight and leadership to the project from our workshop into contracting, resourcing, and execution, while providing the overall guidance, governance, and accountability during delivery. And this resource really provides that executive continuity from what we do within the workshop into execution. So we can use this process as a starting point for that delivery director to really build those relationships with client stakeholders. From the client side, we want to have business and technology stakeholders take part in all or targeted sessions within the workshop, depending on the schedule. The one non-negotiable role from a client that we always enforce as a part of this is that I need somebody in the room that's operating as a product owner to really make real-time decisions as we're going through the workshop activities on scope, requirements, and priorities, and be a part of these sessions. And that does include that I do want my product owners involved with story pointing, with the planning poker that we do to size out the product backlog and have their perspective. We naturally want to have client technology SMEs provide us knowledge of their systems, their processes, and really give us an understanding of what it really takes to implement requirements within the client. What is that path to production? And how do we need to account for that in what we're describing within our backlog and the sizes we put to items within it? Now, we really use these resources to align to our SMEs and really have a meeting in the minds at a technical level. I would say on every workshop, the overall attendees widely varies. I've got some workshops we have as little as 3 from the client side and 2 from ours. Some we have a lot more. But it's really having the right representation in the planning to craft the right product approach and be able to move the process forward. So now let's talk through some of the artifacts or deliverables we produce during the workshop. I'll talk through these high-level outputs we create as a part of this process, and I'll dive into some examples to show you some of the really important ones. All right, so throughout the workshop process, we create several main deliverables that we share with our clients throughout. They comprise our scope, approach, and plan for the product effort we have developed within the workshop. The biggest output of the product backlog workshop is that fully defined, prioritized, and sized epic-based product backlog that is aligned to the milestones we've defined together with our clients. So this will comprise backlog organization items we have reviewed and documented with the client, such as milestones, epics, features, personas, integration points, stories, and even others that surface up just as we get into the context of that particular initiative. But these are all linked to the stories that we create. The backlog really represents the initial roadmap for product execution scope that we have defined together with those client stakeholders. And it also may contain future items or future phases that is not in our scope of work. We don't need to just completely isolate it just to the MVP and what's in front of us, but we can look at crafting the right roadmap to the overall requirements. We'll take a look at an example product backlog on our next slide. We also describe out an initial emergent solution architecture design of the product we're creating. Typically, this is a visual sourced from one of my technical architects that gives us a viewpoint of what the solution needs to look like. Based on conversations and technology direction approaches we've discussed with the client's technology experts in the workshop. But it is meant to inform, not to be an absolute, not to be, this is exactly how everything's going to work. And we're not going down to, a lower level detail of like something like an application architecture, typically at a solution architecture design. This architecture design is complemented by the technical enablers, technical spike stories, and the product backlog that support the functional requirements. So the design here is going to be that guide, and it's going to be based on documented assumptions about direction and backlog spikes, proof of concepts, to really support the efforts of implementation and ensure that we have the right understanding and capacity to make the iterations through technical spikes and the overall planning we need to do around the architecture. Now, the engagement plan itself, so we use a modeling tool. I will talk about it in, I think, maybe 2 or 3 slides. but really a tool that we use to plan out agile-based teams based on capacity. Now, what we do here is we combine up the size of the product backlog with a team that can deliver, documenting, the team members, what that pod needs to look like, and who's also contributing to velocity, and what the metrics are around that. So we can really make an alignment between the size of our product backlog and the team we need to deliver. This gives us, really the overall plan on how we're going to be addressing sprints, number of sprints we need to have, when we complete with that first milestone, what might the second one look like, what does that team look like from both the client side and the Softvision side? Because in a lot of cases, when I'm going through workshops, it's a co-blended team. And that will be in the example that I'll cover in a slide or two. Again, if it's a front-facing, user-facing app product that we're building, we will do UX prototypes inside of the body of the product backlog workshop. And these are pretty much, quick hit, a couple of screens that we can use to really get visual on some of the key visual requirements we might have within our backlog. Now, how that typically takes form is when we're going through our backlog workshop session in day one, as we're going through the list of the product backlog, the UX designers in the back is sitting in the room listening into conversation, and we'll routinely ask, for particular user stories that we discuss, does this make sense on something we can get visual? And in a lot of cases, this works very well within our workshop process, where give a designer a few hours with some some parameters around it. We can get something very visual pretty quickly into the process, and also allow the client to start to see and explore how might this look like. And lastly, the deliverable that the client's always looking for is wrapping this together in with a budget into an overall proposal. Now, our proposal decks that come off of a product backlog workshop, short, sweet, to the point. It's really all about surfacing up the discussion, the artifacts, the decisions we've made within the product backlog workshop, so that we can share that perspective, both within Softvision, but also more importantly within the client, so that the stakeholders in which we're working with, we know that they've got to enable this solution to go forward on their side. So we want to arm them with all the information necessary to be able to take that up, inside of the committee approach, up the approval chain, to really make the project be something that we can really go forward with. Now, of course, all these deliverables that we're describing here, they're in the client hands. We distribute them regularly during the process, but also these will serve to be key enablers when we start getting our own Softvision pod teams ramped up on the process. And one thing I didn't mention yet is that as I'm going through my workshop process, and we're now that we're doing all these virtually through Teams, through WebEx, whatever the medium is, we record all the sessions as kind of a repository of the decisions we made. Not just what we're capturing from the written down information, but that's a great starting point to enabling the team to start to listen into the recordings, understand the perspectives of client product owners, what the discussion was on a particular line item, so we can kind of see, okay, why was it scored? Why was the story pointing a 34? Why was it a priority 3 item? So we definitely want to leverage those as a subsequent deliverable that we bring to the table as an output. All right, so I said I was going to be talking a bit about the user stories that we actually do record within a product backlog workshop. So this is some examples. Now, what we naturally want to have is that we want to get stories in that typical user story format. As a user, I want X so that I can achieve this value. A lot of times I start my product backlog workshops and I'm taking inputs from clients. I don't have all of that from the story definition. So we are using the workshop to properly explore that out, make sure we connect up with the right persona. We have the right definition of what we're looking to do for that particular line item. and also the value proposition for why this is important. But then, you start to see that, yeah, it starts to get very wide on the amount of detail that we're capturing on a story by story standpoint. So during the workshop effort, we really are going to review each story, in detail. Typically, on the first pass, you're spending about 3 to 5 minutes per story to get the right definition and agreement. And at that time, we're going to be redefining, reshaping the story. It may mean that we're breaking apart stories into subsequent stories and defining things like, predecessor IDs and linked stories. But starting to explore out, what those dependencies are, from both the story standpoint and, as we get into the technical side of the backlog, how they relate to technical dependencies. Now, each of these stories, as we're defining them out, we're collecting, a sense for where does it fit from a milestone standpoint and prioritization, while, being able to, keep additional notes on, what we think this story is defined right now. We're obviously going with information as we have it during the workshop. Doesn't mean that there aren't going to be follow-ups, but where we have key decision points on particular requirements, this is typically where I would be creating a technical spike story to explore out, option A, option B, and something that we want to put capacity towards so that we can use that to inform the long-term decision that we're making. But the story list itself is something that I keep within in an Excel document as a part of the course of the product backlog workshop process, and it's something that is very easily to create a lot of new stories in a short amount of time, but also easily share with clients during the course of our workshop without trying to get system access kind of in the way of things. It also allows for a lot of flexibility for how each product backlog I create with a client as I go through this process has a slightly different viewpoint. In the case of what I'm showing here, this client, wanted to really call out that we have some stories that we want to do UX UI, that column right over here, which for them really represented that meant for them they needed to do some additional design work in front. And they wanted to designate between stories they've done that design work and stories they haven't. But either way, it's however we shape it up to be with the client and get contextual to what their particular need is. And then documenting out the entirety of the product backlog so we have everything in place. Planning poker. So this is a big part of the process that we go through as we do these workshops. What I typically see is after we get through those first 2 days of the backlog workshop sessions and start getting into sizing, sizing is definitely it's a fun activity. It means that you're trying to size a pretty large product backlog as we go through this. But we do this together with an online tool, and I am bringing in resources from the client, product ownership, technical stakeholders, as well as resources from Softvision to make the sizing together. So I think I just saw a question related to that, but this is ultimately who's related to in the sizing. So I am showing an example from a particular engagement with a client where I had two of my product owners, two of the people that were actually writing requirements from the client side engaged, as well as somebody from their business taking part in sizing. Two technical stakeholders from their side, a development lead and an architect. But then we are also bringing in, myself doing sizing, as well as one of our developers on that phase one to take part in the sizing of the entirety of that backlog. Now, it is meant to be consensus driven, and what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get a challenger approach to really make sure that we understand what that particular requirement is seeking to represent, document what our assumptions are, and kind of get to the details so we can understand, why does GF have a 21 and P has an 8? And getting agreement on, are we right or wrong with the assumptions we're making, or the thinking on how complex that particular story is. Now, all the story pointing assumptions we capture in the backlog, and like I said before, the recording of the planning poker session is definitely important as a leave behind to the technical team. Now, what I really like to think about, as we go through this process is that The pointing of each story then becomes an initial story pointing budget to be managed during the project by the overall team. Now, we're obviously sizing very early on in the process. If you think about where we are in the the whole sequence of activities by the time we get into sizing, we've spent maybe 2 weeks on and off to be able to get into the sizing. This gives us a budget. It doesn't mean that these are the story points that we hand off to developers and say, go off and implement it. Think about this as a budget. All the stories that come out of a product backlog do need to be broken down further. They need to be elaborated. They need to be split out. They need to have full acceptance criteria. And we definitely embrace that. Part of our planning is really trying to say, what do we think that overall capacity is, validated by assumptions, and then use that to start to build out a teaming model that can be used to address this product backlog. But we do want to account for the fact that there is going to be change in this process. There is going to be change in your agile-based requirements. We are going to miss stories when we go through our product backlog workshop, that there is going to be discovery when we come into execution. And some of that is what we handle when we get to this next part, which is really our teaming modeling and how we go about doing this. So I mentioned before, we have an online a modeling tool that we use to collaborate with clients. Now, what a client would see when we come into this tool as a part of our workshop process, we finish sizing. We know the size of our product backlog. In the case of what I'm representing here, I'll make it bigger so everybody can see if I can get it right. What we're representing here is the backlog is 1,348 story points. Now, I've said that we account for flexibility in how the backlog is going to be refined and shaped during execution. We keep a couple of adjustments to the overall capacity, such as, we know there's going to be bugs, and that needs to be accounted for in capacity. But also we know that there needs to be what we call story point contingency. And this allows us to account for, in the overall capacity, in the overall budget, accounting for the difference in variation in size when requirements that, we sized the requirements of 34, it's split apart into 4 stories. And, they were 8 points each. So we saved 2 points, or it went to an average of, 21. So we need to be able to have enough capacity to be able to achieve the output and use that story point contingency as a tool for the product owners to decide, do we want to spend more time on that particular requirement, or do we want to constrain it to what we initially sized within the within the workshop for the sizing? But this teaming model will then, allow us to create the overall, define out the overall team, who's contributing velocity to the program, at what size, shape, and scale. For example, if we have dev leads, we're not assuming that a dev lead is going to be 100% functional and crushing points the entire time, but rather that they're also leading the team and doing some level of capacity in the overall program. This modeling tool will allow us to plan out projects that can span multi-years, multi-pods. But really, what we're trying to do here is make sure that we construct a team together with the client that we can agree on all the kind of variables that you see within the screen, including where the team resources are sourced from. And in this example, we have a couple of resources that are sourced from the client that are contributing velocity, and at what percentage. But overall, this puts forth an overall plan that could give us our overall timeline, number of sprints, and then also, also the budget of what we think this program is going to cost. Now, as we go through this, the client is somebody that is a first-class citizen when we come into this discussion, and we tailor this approach to getting exactly what we can agree to, so that we can go forward in the overall planning of the program. So lastly, let's spend a few minutes discussing on how this enables our SPE teams that are starting to do work on these new projects. So I like to always come back to the deliverables that we're defining. The really thing to call out here is we want our teams to be able to start with a product backlog, something that the client and Softvision have both had a mutual hand on, and we've come to an agreement. We've documented a lot of what's in it, so that we're not starting off in sprint 0 with a blank sheet of paper, like one of my greatest fears when I start a workshop, but that we have a backlog that describes out functional stories, technical stories. and those initial assumptions, we got a starting point. It doesn't mean it's not going to change. It's absolutely going to change when you go into execution, but it gives us the baseline to be able to start to work from, as well as the solution architecture roadmap. Like I said before, it's an emergent architecture design, but it has those hooks back into our backlog. So we've accounted for having capacity to build that integration to the EMR system, to account for how we're doing an authentication using Auth0. Those are some of the things you start to see in there, and some of the build out you'll see within the technical side, that again, we want to make sure that we have the right capacity, and it's a part of our plan that we've described with the client on how we're going to execute. And then other items, the engagement plan. So what I just showed from that teaming modeling design, the shape of the team, the expectations of velocity on a sprint by sprint basis are all something that, I typically see Scrum Masters, development managers coming back into that worksheet to understand, okay, when I look at, sprints 1 through 10, here's what we have projected for velocity. Now that may change as we get into the actuals of running. But again, a starting point for how we're going to be looking at capacity and velocity. High fidelity UX prototypes that can start to be a starting point for UX iterations. But most importantly, we've got a plan in place with the client, a budget, capacity expectations that we've defined together. We have a proposal that we've put together with them and come to an agreement on a lot of the key concerns for that initiative. So that as we start to get into execution, it's all about trying to make things easier and really accelerate the work we're doing with an SPE. So I thank you for everybody's time. I hope you've learned a lot more about this process during your discussion and how we're using this to lead to successful projects and project startups within our clients. Obviously, there's a lot more detail to dig in on. Feel free to, ask questions, in the forum, online, and I'll try to pick up a few of these as we go through this, or you can reach out to me directly through the email address I have provided. So I'm going to take a look at the questions. So Christian asked, who provides story point estimates for functional and technical epics during the workshop? So I think that's some of what we covered. It's one side of it is getting the definition of those requirements and getting them, put, pen to paper into our product backlog. But when we come to sizing, I really like to say is that Softvision does not create estimates in this process. We create sizes together with our clients. So it's a mutual sizing activity that we do together. So that we're tracking from what we know is as being technical representatives for the client, but taking their input and their feedback on line item by line item as we build up to the size of our product backlog. I'm gonna keep going to Christian here. How do we deal with big epics, part of MVP that cannot be clarified? So in some cases, that may be making some big round numbers and some big requirements. I do want to try and break things down as much as we can, but because this is a time boxed activity that we're getting into, there's a limit on how far we go. What I strive to do within the workshop is that I don't really have. I try to limit the stories we define to less than 55. Right? It doesn't always happen that way, but there's always ways in which we can split things out and start to think about, okay, well, if we just addressed this particular large requirement, what do we want to accomplish within MVP? And start to look at ways in which we can take that client off the ledge and saying, I need everything right away, to what is that first piece? How can we start? And how can we start to, break that chunk apart into something digestible? Looking back through the list. So I think that's it from a question standpoint. I don't know if anybody has any other questions. I know we have a few minutes left, and I did cover on a lot of material. So if there's any other questions, feel free to ask. I'll give it a minute. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending the conversation. Okay. Moro. So Moro, you asked about how Moro asked a question about we assign a number, the client assigns a number. How do we agree on a points? So ultimately, when I'm going through this tool to do it together, the client's on the line as well as Softvision resources on the line. So we do it in real time when we're coming to an agreement on determining, it's not just an average. That's definitely not what we want to do. In the particular example I would have here, I would ask the person at a 21. I would ask the people at the 8. Let's clarify. Let's figure out, who's not thinking about the particular requirement correctly, and trying to get consensus on how we come to an agreement. Because we want to document assumptions, and we may find out that the person at 21, they came in with a different understanding, and we need to equalize that together. Definitely not a newbie question, because that's one of the big parts that we naturally always struggle with as we start to get into planning poker with clients, that haven't gone through a workshop with us before. When we start sizing, the first 3 to 5 stories, that takes at least an hour to get through. Once we establish that cadence and rhythm, and everybody has the same expectations, we speed up and accelerate, and you're trying to get to about a 3-minute average per story. But it does need to be a quick conversation, and really exploring out what are the assumptions that we want to be able to track. What do we think this story means? What is included inside of it? And making sure we all have the same mutual expectation. All right, unless there's any other questions, I think we're at a good point to wrap up. As we do that, I'll put back up my thank you slide. So if anybody wants to copy down my email address, please feel free to reach out to me. And thanks again. Enjoy Product Day.